I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. Australia is home to some remarkable business people, entrepreneurs and leaders who have made their fortunes in a whole range of industries. Tomorrow, the Weekend Australian releases The List, Australia's Richest 250. And once again, this year, it's a fascinating mix of old money, iconic Australian companies, and a new generation of wealth. Business journalist John Stensholt is the List editor for The Australian and is my guest this morning. John, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
I know you probably can't say too much ahead of tomorrow, but give me points for trying. There were 117 billionaires last year and a combined wealth of almost $380 billion. What's it look like this year?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to think about. I mean, a year ago, COVID hit and the markets crashed spectacularly. Remember March 2020, markets, I think all odds, the ASX 200, hit an 8-year low or something like that. And then it's up about 25%. So look, if you think about that in very basic terms, that's going to mean that people on this list have got wealthier in the past year. So yeah, in very basic terms, I think they're doing very well. The iron ore price is up as well a lot. And that has a big effect on the Australian economy. It has a big effect on some of the wealthiest people here in Australia. They're iron ore magnates, mining magnates. So yeah, they're doing a lot better. That's probably the best thing I can say. If the market's up and commodity prices are up, that really means that the wealth of these people are up too.
So Gina Rinehart was number one. Is she number one again this year? Yeah,
I mean, clearly, given how well listed iron ore companies have done, if you compare that to her private company, which had a record profit last year, and remember she announced, I think it was sort of November, December, that she'd actually paid off the $10 billion debt that her Hancock prospecting only took out about 6 years ago to get the Roy Hill mine going. And that's about 4 years ahead of schedule. So that gives you a good idea of what a fantastic time Gina's had. So yeah, it's pretty obvious, I think, that she's done very, very well.
Fair enough. So the iron ore magnates will do well. The usual names, I presume, will be there, the Pratts, those sorts of people. Is there much of a change, though, in how wealth's accumulated? I know you've done this for a while, and property has always been sort of the bedrock of many fortunes. Is that still the case?
I don't think you'd be surprised to know that the technology sector's really hotted up in the last few years. Take, shopping habits even during the pandemic. People were locked down at home or working from home. So e-commerce did really, really well. So you wouldn't be surprised to know that e-commerce retailers like the Ruslan Kogers of the world leap onto the list. Software, people had to, software and hardware to work from home. So software companies have done really, really well. So the people behind the software sensations like Atlassian, they had a fantastic pandemic in that regard. So it's shifting around. I mean, look, it's modernizing in that way. I mean, there's always going to be your manufacturing magnates. And as you say, property does underpin a lot of it. But really, you're seeing that technological change, that e-commerce or e-retailing change and, FinServe or, fintech change too. So it is modernizing in that way, Sean.
Last year, Melanie Perkins, co-founder of Canva, jumped onto the list. You've probably just answered the question by mentioning Ruslan Kogan. Are there many of those types of people, a little bit out of the blue for most of the general public who have probably never heard of these people, and suddenly they've made a fortune?
Yeah, Lawrence Escalante, who's a guy that people wouldn't know, but he's a 39-year-old tech magnate, I suppose. His business is called Virtual Gaming World. It's headquartered in Perth, but all of its revenue is derived overseas. In North America is actually its biggest market. So that maybe that encapsulates what the modern world's all about. You can be living anywhere or working anywhere in the world and making your money somewhere else in the world. That's what the internet's done. That's what online retailing's done. So look, he's worth a couple of $1 billion. I mean, his company, is a spectacular success story. Online sort of virtual sweepstakes or gaming, $200 million plus annual profits. That's more than your Atlassians or your Canvas. So yeah, there are always people that leap out like that.
Okay. Now tell us about the process of putting together the list. In one guise or another, you've done this list for many years. How do you go about it? How do you find the numbers?
Well, there's a lot of crunching behind the scenes involved, but when it comes down to it, it's really a few different topics that people make their wealth in. It's your listed companies, so these shareholdings, or your private companies, or your property, and you have your sort of bells and whistles on top of that, Sean, like your private jets maybe, or your super yachts, but that's the icing on top. So really, it's a few sources we go off and get all these data from ASIC filings and ASX filings and stock market filings around the world. And importantly, we try and talk to these people as well. And there's always some good information we can glean from them on background.
I've done some work for you, John, on this a few years back. I remember having a great conversation with Paul Little, a well-known Melbourne identity, who's been on the list. I'm not sure whether he is this year. You had done all the work and your research team had done all the work and the Excel spreadsheeting and given me a number and said, can you check with Mr. Little whether that's the number? And I remember ringing him and he actually, answered the phone and I gave him the number and he argued with me over about a $4 million, which at the end of the day was a very small amount in his total wealth. That's all right. I mean, you take his word. And then he rang me about a day later and said, actually, I got that wrong. You were right. That $4 million actually forgotten about a property he had. What I think that demonstrated is just how good your researchers are to get so exact that even Paul Little didn't quite realise his total wealth, but you did.
Oh, look, I think we do. There is a lot of science behind it. And there's always people who say, oh, well, what do you really know about these people? Publicly, I suppose we can't really reveal what we talk to them about. But I reckon, Sean, as you know, that, a good 80-85% of the list will engage with us on background or confidentially. Now, maybe they're telling us what they want us to know. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of rigor and analysis behind it. And then you marry that with actually speaking to them. And as you say, we've been doing it for years. They know that annual call's coming. They're happy to engage with us because we've built up that trust over that time. And yeah, you're right. People would be surprised to know what they'll tell you and what, particularly in the last few years when people have made a lot of money overseas or, with tech stocks that are listed in America that maybe we don't know about here, but they're always willing to share a good story, I think, about themselves. Maybe not necessarily when they're not doing so well, though.
No one really wants to be on the list, but even worse than that is falling off the list. Isn't that true?
I think it is. Yeah, that's right. So maybe they'll find a few extra assets in the cupboard to keep them on the list every year. Sure.
The other thing is that the tax office always take this list and have a look at it. And I suppose if that's the case, it's in the interest of the participants to be pretty accurate.
Yeah, exactly right. And in the last few years, the tax office has actually started publishing their own annual list in a way of the biggest taxpayers. So they do that roughly November, December every year. It's actually really good information for us too, because they'll say which corporations have paid, big tax numbers, the previous year. And that gives me some information to go on to find new names. I've done a lot of it that way. So yeah, they certainly have taken an interest in it a long time. We used to joke that the most sales would be in those news agents that are near tax offices and the like. They'd get a crate of them to go through. I guess we're happy to help in that situation, but you can marry that bit together. And we also look at philanthropy now too, Sean. We've done a sort of top philanthropic or philanthropist list. So another sort of big thing that goes with having money, paying tax, and also being generous, I think, as well. They need to do a lot of that, probably more in both situations.
John, stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to John Stensholt, the man who puts together the list, Australia's Richest 250, which will be in The Australian tomorrow. The philanthropy is interesting because many people are extremely giving but don't like to talk about it.
Yes, I've found that they probably will discuss more about their wealth number than they will with their philanthropist number at the moment. Now, again, I hope that changes. And I've got a couple of good features in the magazine about people who think that people should talk about it more and why they should or shouldn't. And there's counter arguments about it. I think it's important because, you can't do the philanthropy without being wealthy. So why not talk about that as well?
I think it was Dick Smith, wasn't it, who was always very loud on getting people to talk about philanthropy for that very reason, because it actually gathers momentum.
Yeah, exactly right. These people are competitive. So if they want to be competitive about what, the amount of money they give away too, well, I think that I'm all for that. Yeah, Andrew Forrest has been a big, valuable person in that regard. He actually did a tour, not last year, now it's the year before, when his Minderoo Foundation put out an annual report. Now, you could see that as a bit of spruiking and a bit of, look at me sort of stuff. But look, the guy's getting, more than $1 billion in dividends every year. So he's putting a lot of that into his philanthropic endeavours. So, I think there should be more of that discussion for sure.
I'm trying. Is it Paul Ramsay Foundation? I think is the biggest giver in the country. Is that right?
That's right. But again, Sean, there's that shift. Ramsay left that money behind when he died a few years ago. Whereas I think more of the younger people, the tech people in particular, Twiggy Forrest as well, Anthony Pratt, are doing a lot of more of that giving when they're in the middle of their careers. So there is that shift in that regard.
Okay. Back to the rich list. What's the gender balance? Men and women, always been many, many more men on it than women. Is there any improvement?
Not really. And again, it's a shame. I mean, the tech industry has admitted itself that it's got issues with, having enough tech founders or female entrepreneurs in that regard. I mean, Melanie Perkins is a clearly notable, fantastic example, actually. She's incredibly successful at a very young age. But there needs to be more Melanie Perkins. There needs to be more female Atlassians and that sort of thing. So, no, it's still a problem, Sean. And that just feels like we're at the same number or the same percentage of women on the list that we maybe were 10, 15 years ago.
What about family companies? There have been names like the Packers and the Loeys and the Pratts who have forever been on the list, and sometimes as individuals, sometimes as family companies. Is new money sort of shifting away from that family office style setup?
I think you'll see that with the tech founders, because what they do is they tend to invest in other tech companies rather than keeping it in a family company, perhaps, or hoarding it in property. So they talk more about giving it away. So, look, I mean, yes and no. I mean, Mike Cannon-Brookes and Scott Farquhar both have, modern style family companies, I suppose, but it's more about investing in some of their passions, be it renewable energy and other things rather than just the wealth protection. So there's a bit of a difference there, I think.
Okay. So, John, how many years have you done a rich list in some sort of guise? I'm going to guess 15. Would that be about right?
I think the first one I edited was about 2008, Sean. What's that, 13 odd years? Yeah, I was a trainee at BRW from 2000 and we used to do our own research then. So, goodness me, I suppose I've worked on it for 20 years. Yeah, right.
So tell me, what do you think is the big change or big couple of changes in that 20 years in the rich list?
Well, the sheer amount of money that's been created in Australia in that time is probably the headline thing. We had 20 years of really, unbroken economic growth. I think the reason you do it in a way is obviously because the readers like it, but it does show up trends in what's working in business. The emergence of a decent Australian tech scene, I think, is one notable thing that's happened in the last few years, the Atlassians of the world, but also the investments like the Blackbird Ventures and other sort of wealthy people that are investing in that scene. I think there's a long way to go in that regard, but I think there is genuine excitement in what a modern Australia can be, rather than just building apartments or owning industrial property land. There is some genuinely talented people out there on these rich lists that want to do different things and also want to give back too. So there is a shift in that regard.
Fantastic. John, look, good luck with the launch tomorrow. I know it's a very busy time for you, so thank you for talking to us here on Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
That was John Stensholt, lists editor at The Australian.